Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Our community is filled with diverse stories. Yep. And we recognize that our story begins with the indigenous peoples of this land. We recognize that we are broadcasting this lecture on lands that have been inhabited by indigenous peoples for millennia, and we would like to honor the centuries of indigenous people who walked on Turtle Island before us. My name is Adrian, and I'm the Visitor Services Coordinator here at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. I am thrilled to welcome everyone to the autumn series of our virtual museum lectures. We hope these lectures provide a bit of historical joy and also spark imagination and exploration of our city's rich history. Before I turn it over to Adam, I want to take a moment or two or three to tell you about our other upcoming lectures so you can mark your calendars and tell all your friends. On September 29th, in 2 weeks, I'll present Where They Walk, the making of the annual guided spirit walks with a behind the scenes look at our annual, guided spirit walks, including a look into the many primary sources that make the walks possible and such a great window into our history. We are very excited to welcome another special guest in October, Natasha Henry, historian and president of the Ontario Black History Society. Natasha will be giving a talk on the history of Ontario's Black segregated schools on October 13th. On October 27, I'll be back to talk about and discuss the somewhat lost and mostly forgotten Third Welland Canal. On November 10th, we'll present our First World War series, Stories from the Front, with stories from our collection about experiences at home and at the front from St. Catharines. On November 24th, our public programmer, Sarah Nixon, and I will be back with an interesting lecture about a report commissioned by the United States Congress, Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, written by Samuel Gridley Howe in 1863 on the condition of freedom seekers in Canada. Local interviews with both freedom seekers and recognizable names of the city's established businessmen opens up new histories we aren't used to hearing. And finally, on December 8th, our curator, Kathleen, will present a talk on local fashion and our new exhibit, Marking Time, which features the important moments of life and the textiles that go with them. Additionally, we have a couple of upcoming programs that I'd like to share with you that might be of interest for our audience tonight. Collecting, researching, and preserving your family history is challenging work. As museum professionals, we get it. What do you do with those old photographs, your mother's silverware, or your wedding gown? How do you record the stories that have been in your family forever before it's too late? The St. Catharines Museum wants to help you with these questions. We're offering a 2-day virtual workshop to help you figure out how to organize and care for the information and materials in your own family collections. Join us remotely on Saturdays, October 24th and November 7th from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. From a screen and into the comfort of your home, St. Catharines Museum staff will guide you through how to organize and keep track of your family records and photographs, how to care for and store family heirlooms and special collectibles, and how to write and record your family's story. As a part of the workshop, the genealogy experts at Mayhome Foundation will also lead a tutorial giving tips and tricks for conducting genealogical research. Registration is $50 per person for both dates included, one fee, 2 dates, but spots are limited to keep it nice and intimate. Register today by calling the museum at 905-984-8880 or by clicking reply to the email that we sent you this evening at museum@stcatharines.ca. Of course, I'm almost done. Of course, I'm very excited to welcome our special guest lecturer tonight, Adam Montgomery, for his presentation, Stones and Symbols of Victoria Lawn Cemetery, this evening. We asked Adam to join us specifically for September, because September is all about our annual guided spirit walks at Victoria Lawn Cemetery. Our annual guided spirit walks at Victoria Lawn Cemetery are virtual this year for reasons I don't need to obviously get into. You can tune in and catch the live stream of our presentation called Playing Favorites, Stories from the Past. We have selected our favorite scenes from the last 8 years of guided spirit walks, filmed them with our amazing volunteer performers in costume, and we will stream the presentation on YouTube at 7 p.m. this coming Saturday, September 19th. There's also a pre-show chat with the cast at 6:30 p.m. Register by donation by emailing the museum at museum@stcatharines.ca. Speaking of donations, might I encourage everyone to make a donation to the museum in support of our programming. Your donations help us to continue to provide the high quality and enjoyable programming that you have come to expect from us. We really appreciate any donation you're able to make. Give us a call at 905-984-8880 during our operating hours to make a donation, or come into the museum to make a donation too. You can do that because we're open now. Yay. For those of you who are new to the virtual museum lecture series, welcome. We are broadcasting on YouTube. I'm sure you know that's how you're watching, which is great. But it doesn't really allow you to participate. However, that's where the YouTube chat box comes in. Located to the right-hand side of the stream, or maybe below if you're on a mobile device, the chat box is where you can post your comments and questions. And I'll also be in the chat box for anyone who has any technical difficulties. I see a few people already commenting, so welcome to everyone. So you can post your questions throughout. I'll make a note of them, and then Adam and I will moderate the questions at the end of his presentation. There is a bit of a time delay, so we'll stick around for there's about 30 seconds. So we will stick around to catch all of your questions. And I've just brought up this slide here just to confuse you all. A little bit of a meta screen share here, just to show you where the chat box is over here at the right-hand side. Now, enough from me. On to tonight's presentation. Adam Montgomery, PhD, is a historian of medicine, military history, and cemetery history whose work has been featured on CBC Radio and CTV News, as well as in the Globe and Mail and Toronto Star. His past publications examined mental trauma in Canadian soldiers over the past 100 years, and he published 2 books on the subject, The Invisible Injured and After the War in 2017 and 2018, respectively. Over the past several years, his research has been in the field, which I can greatly appreciate, walking old cemeteries across Ontario and beyond, promoting their importance as historic sites, and exploring the stones, people, and stories they hold. His current project is a book on Niagara cemeteries, still in the research stages, and another book that will look at some of his ancestors here in Niagara. Stay tuned to Adam's social media and website and all that stuff. And I'm sure he'll give us more detail on how you can follow him and his research. So please join me in welcoming, I'm going to turn on his video here. Please join me in welcoming Adam. Hi, Adam.
Hello. Thanks,
Take it
Adrian.
away. I'm going to disappear. Right. I'll be in the background if you need
Okay.
me.
Yeah, and if there are any technical issues, just shoot me a little thing in the chat box there.
For sure, I will do that. And I will stop sharing, and the share is all yours.
Okay. I just got to get myself to, let's see here. There we go. Okay. I'll set up here. I don't know why it's
you're good to go. If you click
there we go.
Yeah, you're good.
There we go. Okay. Thanks, Adrian. So first off, hello everyone. My name's Adam, as I'm sure you guessed. Thanks, Adrian and the St. Catharines Museum for asking me to do this presentation. I'm always excited when I get asked to do these. Those who follow my activity on social media and elsewhere will know that I love walking old cemeteries and I love promoting them at every opportunity. So I'm always feel blessed and thankful when I'm asked to give these talks, particularly in Niagara, which is my home region. So So tonight's presentation, it's always a little difficult when I'm asked to give these things, particularly when we're talking about a cemetery as big as Victoria Lawn, which I'll get into in a second. But the biggest question is always, well, what does the audience expect for something like this? And also, how do you tackle a cemetery, covering a cemetery as big as Victoria Lawn, where you have so many people buried, so much history, et cetera? So what I chose to do for this one is I will be talking about stones and symbols along the way, but what I chose to do was actually sort of go back in my mind to the first time that I visited. And what I tried to do was sort of walk it with a beginner's eyes a little bit and think about what are some of the stones that stand out the first time you're walking through, what are some of the sort of features of it. And so I thought that way, for those in St. Catharines or Niagara who haven't actually visited, they'll have a sense, and if they have visited, they'll sort of be able to pick out landmarks. But also for those not in Niagara that are joining us, that they'll be able to actually sort of see some of the prominent things or some of the noticeable things when you first walk it. So that was sort of my rationale, and I'm always happy for feedback after about about what content you found the most intriguing, what you didn't, et cetera, et cetera. So and I'll give you all of my various activities at the end, so you can contact me or follow my various activities on social media, website, etc. So let's get started. So just to start, some quick basic facts about Victoria Lawn. So it was established in 1856 in St. Catharines, very close to the Welland Canal. Originally, it was called the St. Catharines Cemetery, but was renamed in honor of Queen Victoria at the turn of the century, 20th century, that is. It was designed by a man named William Mundy, who was a landscape gardener. He arrived around 1850 from Scotland and lived in Hamilton. He was in what was then called Canada West for only about 8 years, and he died early at 47. I haven't actually, none of the sources I've seen so far actually state how, but you can sort of take your pick, unfortunately, in those days. But he was responsible for a few big projects in Toronto. One of them was I'm blanking on the name, but the Normal School, I think it was called, doing some of the garden things there, some of the projects there. And in this neck of the woods, of course, Victoria Lawn. So Victoria Lawn is one of Canada's, a term that's often used, these terms are often used interchangeably, a rural cemetery or a garden cemetery. So just going to go through my notes here and explain a little bit. I won't get into the whole background. There's lots of literature on this. If you even just Google garden cemeteries, you'll see a whole bunch of literature come up from all over North America and Europe to explain more, and there are even entire books written on it. But just a little background. So at the end of the 18th century in Europe, with the growth of industrialization and cities themselves, many urban burial grounds became overcrowded, particularly churchyards. And in the minds of contemporaries, they were seen as bad for health, amongst other things. There was something called the Miasma Theory, which basically, I won't get into that, but it had to do with what they called vapors that were seen as harmful. So people actually believed that some of these churchyards that got so filled up, where people literally could smell, in some cases, sorry to be sort of explicit, but rotting corpses or smells. They thought that these things could actually be damaging to your health, even just by inhaling them. So over time, this led to sort of reform movements about how to fix this problem. So in the 19th century, they came up with the idea to create these sort of large landscape cemeteries that could be used not just for interment and for visiting of the deceased by relatives, but also as places of public recreation. So, and in fact, before large public parks were even established, cemeteries like Victoria Lawn were some of the most popular places to visit. The public visited it often, especially on Sundays, other times. They were on the tourists flocked to them when they came. They were featured on postcards, stereographs, all kinds of things. So they were sort of a fashionable place for the middle class to visit and to sort of take like a leisure stroll, if you will. So they had this really interesting sort of role in society. And in places like there's a famous cemetery in Brooklyn called Greenwood, and Greenwood is actually seen as Brooklyn's first large public park. So they had this interesting role that is hard for us to imagine today when we have lots of public parks, and cemeteries for a lot of people are seen as places that are morbid or depressing or places to avoid. Instead, these were seen as places like there was definitely a sense that the main purpose was mourning and visiting deceased loved ones. But at the same time, Victorian culture, specifically the middle class culture of the Victorian era, really flocked to these places as places of leisure. So, and you can see this at Victoria Lawn and some of the landscaping. That's the remnants of old aspects of the grounds, like where the fountain used to be and things like that. So these were places that were beautiful. People enjoyed visiting them, and particularly for people of lesser means, they were ways to see what was considered great art. And so really places that were frequented a lot. So going back to Victoria Lawn itself, we have over 79,000 people interred and about 30,000, over 30,000 monuments. So it is quite literally a city of the dead. Covers 170 acres of land. And, I've kind of put there half jokingly, but not really jokingly, that a great place for a stroll. So if you're somebody, whether you're somebody like me who likes to go for the history and the stories and the stones, even if you're just looking for a place to go, often less crowded than public parks, there are lots of meandering pathways and places to go there that you can sort of get some solitude and sort of take in a lot of different things. So just quickly here, I wanted to show you, I won't read the whole thing because it's a lot of minutia, but this is from the actual administration office at Victoria Lawn Cemetery. Inside, they have an original advertisement from when it was still called St. Catherine's Cemetery. So I just thought you might want to have a look at that briefly. So before I get into the sort of what I would call first eyes walking through the cemetery tour, just several interesting people. These are the sort of folks that always get brought up by locals when you say, I'm going to Victoria Lawn. People ask you, have you seen X? And these are the people. So we have William Hamilton Merritt, was a War of 1812 veteran, a merchant, and a big promoter of the Welland Canal. He wasn't always the most successful businessman, and some of his ideas proved to be overly ambitious, but he's a major figure in the history and certainly responsible for a lot of the industrial development of the area. Also a big landowner as well. Then you have the Reverend Anthony Burns, who was a Baptist preacher and freedom seeker from Virginia, and his case attracted a lot of attention when he sought freedom from his enslaver in 1853. He was then imprisoned in Boston, returned to Virginia, and then eventually ransomed. So he became a minister in St. Catherine's, and I think it was 1860, 1861, and then died at just 28, sadly, from tuberculosis in 1862. So his grave is there, and actually finally located it thanks to Rochelle Bush. So Rochelle, if you're out there, thanks again for helping me find it. And then the last person on this sort of short list was Gwendolyn Moloch, who was the first practicing female doctor in St. Catherine's. And in addition to other things, she served as the medical consultant for the Toronto Children's Aid Society. So this is a very, very short list. And when you go there, you can imagine why when you see how many people are there, and all kinds of movers and shakers from all walks of life buried there. So now we're going to get started on the sort of first eyes tour, I'll call it. So one of the, perhaps the most noticeable thing, and you saw it in my intro screen, is the Develo Mills Carolyn Tower. It's a beautiful piece of architecture. And so just a little bit about it. It was erected in 1949, and it commemorates David Mills and his wife, Ella. So David was a native of St. Catherine's, and he emigrated to the United States, and he worked for a company called the Fellows Medical Manufacturing Company. He actually later developed a spark plug, and by both skill and luck, it was put into all Buick automobiles, and he invested in the company and made a lot of money. So, despite being quite wealthy, he was also known as a philanthropist, donated a lot of money to various causes, and they established the Develo Mills Foundation in 1935. So he died in 1944, and he had donated a lot of money to hospitals, churches, schools, the YMCA, YWCA, and several other organizations. So before its liquidation in 1955, the foundation had donated $10.5 million to various causes in both America, overseas, and then at the St. Catherine's General Hospital, over $300,000, and a wing of the hospital was named after them. So this is a beautiful tower, and you can see it. It's in the what's called the news section, but you can see it from both sides. Usually, if you're close to Queenston, the street, because it's so tall. And what's so beautiful about it is it has all of these bells inside. I think it's 80 something bells inside, little miniature bells, and it plays music on the hour. So it's quite a beautiful thing, and not just to look at, but when you're walking through the cemetery, you can hear it on both sides of the cemetery when you're walking. So it reminds you of the time. And if you're somebody like me and you hear a song 4 or 5 times, you realize you've spent too much time in the cemetery and you should go eat or do something else. But it's just a beautiful, beautiful piece of architecture. And if you're interested in it, you can Google the name. And it's actually considered one of Canada's national recognized sites. I can't remember the term for it, but there's a whole website on it. Part of where I got the information comes from there. So that's that. Another monument I wanted to show you is for the Taylor family. It's this beautiful Celtic cross. I know the picture on the left is a bit far away for you to see the details, but it's hard to, it actually, if I can show you, I don't know if, yeah, you can see my mouse cursor there, but it's right next to a tree that's often growing right in front of it. So to get a picture of the whole thing, you have to stand back and on a strange angle. So it's really hard to get it up close and have the whole thing in the frame. But beautiful Celtic cross with the usual sort of very intricate patterns and things like that. But why this one's particularly interesting is at the base of the cross here, you have an angel. So I'm going to give you a close up here now so you can see closer up. So this is an example. This was one of the ones I remember noticing the first time I walked through, because I came in, there's a sort of back side entrance, I guess you can call it, over here. And you come up a road and you come right around to this curve, and it's sort of right here. So you notice it quite quickly when you come in. And it's a great example of the way that symbols in these cemeteries, old cemeteries, spoke or speak to you through the sort of iconography that they use. So in this case, you actually have here 2 passion flowers here, stylized passion flowers. And then here you have this angel. So the passion flowers are often interpreted as symbolizing the passion of Christ for various reasons. The 5 stamen, or the 5 wounds of Christ. And then there are other symbolisms that various scholars and theologians have come up with over time, but often associated with the passion of Christ and Jesus. So you have that symbolism there. And here you have this beautiful angel. Now, what he's actually holding, or what it's holding, is a trumpet or a horn. And so oftentimes this is interpreted as the Archangel Gabriel, because of the connection to the Annunciation, when Mary was told that she would bear the Savior. But it's hard to actually tell, because sometimes the features can be sort of generic angel, I guess you'd call it. So in a lot of cases, people will just call it a resurrection angel. But the symbolism here, where it's sitting at the base of the cross, and all of the various, holding the horn and the various other symbolisms, it's basically conveying the message that the deceased are waiting for the call to resurrection. That's what the trumpet / horn symbolizes, is the second coming and the calling to the resurrection. So this idea that the deceased is waiting, and then the call will come and they will rise to heaven. So if you ever see that, you see one of these angels with a horn, that's the symbolism. And in this case, it's just beautiful, beautiful art even to look at. So quite an enjoyable one. The next one nearby is very noticeable, again, because of the sort of unique nature of it. So this is for a man named Sir Frederick William Benson. I won't get into all of Benson's biography, but he was a longtime military member, and he served in various theaters. But in Canada, the Fenian raids of 1866, when the Irish Republican Brotherhood tried to, basically they were attacking British Army forts and customs posts and other things in Canada. So he was one of the people that fought in the Fenian raids on the Canadian side, or the British side. But what's interesting about his monument beyond that is the fact that you can actually see, and I'll give you a close up here, you can actually see an officer's sword draped right over the top of it. So this is in Canadian cemeteries quite rare. I can only think of one other example that I've seen. I know there are more, but in terms of my own wanderings, they're quite rare. So it's just a sort of neat example of where a profession or pride in profession is stated right on the monument. And obviously the symbolism of being draped over the cross, I don't think requires an explanation. The next stone, which is also again close by, these are termed as sort of what they call recumbent crosses. So when you see something like this, first of all, I always feel it's important to point out because there is confusion. And I remember a long time ago, first walking these cemeteries, that I was confused as well. You look at it and you think somebody's in there, but they're actually not. The people are usually, it's the monument itself is the monument, and the people are usually buried sort of in the standard spots, either beside it or at one of the heads. So in this case, likely by sort of I'm going to just point to it here, somewhere around here, probably. It's hard to say because this is quite a full family plot. But essentially, it's meant to convey what was part of the medieval revival of the 19th century. So you could see this in things like Gothic architecture and tombstones. And so this one's interesting because it's actually in granite, whereas which started around the 1880s in Canada. So this is somewhat unique in that it is made of what was the sort of newer fashionable stone versus white marble or sandstone or something else that was fashionable earlier. But you'll see various examples like this in different cemeteries. St. Mark's in Niagara-on-the-Lake has quite a few of different kinds, but also recumbent like this. So they're just very interesting to look at because they stand out often compared to the upright stones that are, sort of the standard style, or at least standard position, I should say. So, but again, what's sort of interesting when you learn, it's always interesting, or at least it was to me, when you learn that there's not actually somebody in there, because it sort of looks like there might be, but there isn't. Now, the next stone here, for anybody out there who may have attended my talk last fall, this is a repeat, I apologize, but it's one that I always feel is worth highlighting because it is unique, and it is one that's noticeable when you come into the old section of the cemetery sort of almost immediately. This one is sort of just when you come in the old section through the front gate, through the gates of the old section, main gates where the old superintendent's house is. And you just sort of turn just to the right, and you see it sort of standing out there very prominently. So this is a monument for a woman named Anna O'Neill McKeague and her young son Joseph. And as you can see by the ages, they were both quite young. So just the basic story behind it is that both of them died of tuberculosis, within 3 months of each other in 1897. And so quite a sad story, as was often the case then, and especially with diseases like tuberculosis that killed so many people. But in this case, she died in February and he died in April. So very, very short. You can imagine the traumatic loss for the husband/father. And so what makes this monument unique is that oftentimes you see a representation of faith and mourning in old cemeteries like this, where you'll have it's a woman usually in classical garb and leaning on a cross like this. But in this case, what makes it unique is that it's actually thought to be a representation of Anna herself, and she's holding a rose here. And as you can see, she's in contemporary dress, which is also kind of neat to see, sad but neat to see, because you just don't see that often in these places. The rose she's holding, roses, as they do today, symbolize love, but they have many symbolisms in cemeteries as they do elsewhere. But often in cemeteries, particularly on the gravestones of young children, you'll often see the rose that's wilted, or wilted in the sense of turned downwards, or wilted in the sense of petals have fallen off of it to symbolize that a child has died young. So in this case, It could be interpreted as love, but also likely the fact that her life was short as well. Roses often, and then you can see this in old poetry and literature stretching back to the Middle Ages. And this goes back way back, even further to biblical tradition and elsewhere, of the idea that the human lifespan is short and in many ways resembles a flower or something. The famous one from the Bible about our days are like grass, meaning that we come and we go, and the wind comes and picks us up and we're forgotten. So it's sort of a sad sort of symbolism of the short human lifespan in relation to the sort of grand length of time. So, but it's quite a beautiful monument, regardless of the poignancy of it. And you can see this was actually from a different time, as you can see by the blue sky versus the gray sky. But this was a different day. Fortunately, Anna tends to be quite dirty because she's tall. She's tall, and it's hard for people to get up there and clean it. But it's still quite a beautiful monument either way, and one that I always take a minute to stop and appreciate every time I'm there. The next one, those who follow me on social media will recognize this because I posted this one just the other day. It's an example. I wanted to show this one because I noticed it for the first time, and what was fascinating about it to me was the epitaph. So it's hard to read probably on your screen, but this is for a young man named Herbert Ride. He died at just 30. So Herbert was a jeweler. He was born in Guelph. He was a jeweler in civilian life, and then eventually entered the military, and another victim of tuberculosis. He died at just 30, and it was contracted while he was in service, and his death record from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission states that it says, quote, contracted or due to service, death due to service. So, but what interested me about this one, beyond the sort of, poignancy of the story and his young age, was this epitaph that says, "It is not all of life to live, nor all of death to die." And this is actually, I had to Google this one and sort of look around because I see a lot of these. I've seen thousands, and after a while you get to spot, you can attribute it almost right away to, usually to Judeo-Christian traditions or things like that. But this one was interesting because it's sort of a new age, quote unquote, new age epitaph that's attributed to the American clairvoyant Edgar Cayce. And for anybody not familiar with Edgar Cayce's work, he sort of, as a lot of clairvoyants tend to be, controversial figure, but you can play around on the internet and find quite a bit about him. I remember a long time ago, he had an episode on Unsolved Mysteries, the old Unsolved Mysteries, about him. So an interesting fellow. And I just thought it was very fascinating to see. And it's a good example. I often, epitaphs to me, at least from my experience talking with people that also like to go through old cemeteries, they tend to be one of the most ignored aspects of old gravestones, because I think in a lot of cases, because they're hard to read, particularly on the 19th century stones that have eroded somewhat, but it's actually quite rewarding, and you learn quite a bit from reading them, just because although there are sort of common ones that come from traditions, and there were actually lots of different epitaph books that were just for the sort of, I don't know what the term is, for the one-stop shopper, or for the person that couldn't be bothered to try and come up with something or didn't know what was appropriate. There were epitaph books that you could just select ones from, and there were actually famous ones. But aside from that, there are actually quite a few times you come across epitaphs that are unique or somewhat rare, and it oftentimes can lead you down sort of these research rabbit holes that can be quite fun, and you'll learn quite a bit. You might learn, in some cases you'll find out about an author you didn't know about. One that comes up not fairly often, but more common in the US, but I've seen it in Canada 2 or 3 times, is one that's attributed to poet Richardson, and famous people attribute it to Mark Twain. They actually think he wrote it, but it wasn't written by him. But it says, green sod above, lie light, good night, dear heart, good night, good night. I'm just giving you part of it. But the first time I saw that, I thought it was such a beautiful verse, and I wanted to know the origin of it. And then it took me down this whole rabbit hole of who wrote it, people think it's Mark Twain, but it's not Mark Twain. It was actually an Australian poet. Then I was reading about him, et cetera, et cetera. So you can actually have quite a bit of interesting sort of fun just from doing something like looking at an epitaph and trying to find out the origins of it. And even though it can be hard to read them sometimes, I encourage you to give it a shot. Bring a magnifying glass or just sort of sit there. Oftentimes these days, with how good the camera lenses are, there are lots of times where I actually can't read it with the human eye, but then I take a picture of it and bring it home and zoom in, and I can immediately figure it out. So you can use technology to sort of help you to figure that out in some cases if you can't. Anyway, here I go rambling about epitaphs. Next stone. This is one for Henry Robinson, a young boy who died in 1852. It's quite eroded. I had a hard time even figuring out the age, which is why I don't have any details. I don't like to often guess if I'm not sure. But why I wanted to show it to you is it's another example of some of the common symbolisms you'll see. And you see this quite a bit at Victoria Lawn. So it probably, for most of you, goes without saying, you're probably quite aware of how young how so many children died young in those days of various things, any number of things. So you see sadly, quite a few tombstones for children. And oftentimes you can tell by the size. In this case, it's actually an example where it's a little more difficult to tell immediately because this stone is a bigger stone than the others. But oftentimes when you see stones like this one, or stones like this one in the background, or stones like those, they tend to be they tend to be either footstones or stones for children. And especially if it's got the symbolisms and things, the footstones tended to have just the initials and date. Whereas when you see something like this, you can almost immediately identify it as a stone for a child. They would often take the same symbols and things for adults and just miniaturize them for children. So you'll get a case like obelisks. You see quite a few obelisks, and you'll see once in a while, you'll see a tiny little obelisk. And I hesitate to say it almost looks cute at first because it's so strange to see it so small and compact. But then you realize you sort of stop smiling when you realize that it's for a young child. So these miniature versions of stones often indicate that it's for a child. In this case, I wanted to show you, so close up here. So weeping willows, very common in old cemeteries in the 19th century. And I'm sure, again, I probably don't have to explain to most, if not all of you, the symbolism, even the fact that they're called often weeping willows. They tend to sort of symbolize, or they mostly symbolize mourning. And in this case, it's hard to tell because this stone is old, and here it had some various stuff on it. It looks like lichens or mold or something, but this is actually a lamb that's sleeping, lying down here. So the head's here, there's a leg here, and then the body's here. So lambs you see quite a lot in 19th century cemeteries. They symbolize innocence. You can also see lambs, and I've seen them in Jewish cemeteries as well, one of the few shared iconographies in some of the cemeteries in Canada. But so the lamb symbolizes innocence. In the Christian case, also symbolizes Jesus, Lamb of God. And then you can always find the biblical passages to support this, like suffer the little children to come unto me, and the various other things. And then obviously Jesus as the Lamb of God. So here you have this willow sort of draped over or mourning over the lamb. So the symbolism is quite obvious. But the sleeping lamb, the lambs were also, when you go a little deeper in terms of the theology, innocence and sadness here as well. But when you get into some of the mentalities, young children especially, were seen to be purer and without sin because of the fact that they hadn't lived longer and had the ability or had the time to start doing bad things. So so in a lot of cases, there's sort of a dual component to it, but mostly the symbolism is mourning. So if you see lambs, you can 99% of the time tell yourself that it's a child. I have seen it, and you do see it for young adults, sometimes teenagers, and I have even seen it on adult stones, but in the vast majority of cases, it's for young children. This next one I wanted to show you just because it's so neat and so unique. It's actually one you could miss depending on how you walk the cemetery, but I saw it the first time I was there, just because of it really stood out to me. This is actually made of cast iron, which is very rare. The only other cast iron one I know of in Niagara is at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Cemetery in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and there might be one other one. My memory is failing me, but they're quite rare, to the point that nobody's actually sure. People think from the literature that that the epitaph, or sorry, I guess you'd call it the epitaph, though it's not a stone. The information, the biographical information, might have been painted on it somewhere, likely was, so that the person could be identified. But over time, it fades away, like the paint on the old Gothic cathedrals in Europe, and so eventually you're left with just the cast iron thistle. But it's quite a neat little thing, just because it is so unique. And when you look at it, you can see the little pricklies on it, little thorns on it, and then you can see here the top, the flower here. So just a neat little marker. And to the left of it, there's a stone for a family called the Lambert family. So I'm still trying to figure out if it might be for one of the members of the Lambert family. But again, it's really hard to know without having any information on it. But it's a neat little marker, just because it is so unique. So I encourage you, if you are in the area and you walk Victoria Lawn, to try and find it. The next one, this is actually nearby, the one I just showed you. Another sort of mystery, in the sense that because of the relatively early death of this man, David Edwards, at just 20, before provincial death records were kept in Ontario, hard to find information about a lot of people before 1869, when those records started. And even then, they were very spotty for several years afterwards. But in this case, a beautiful, beautiful stone. There's quite a lot. You can see Gothic tracery here. So you see some symbols that you also see on like various aspects of Gothic buildings. And then actually here in the center, this I think is the Eye of Providence, which is a Masonic symbol. So you can see the eye here and the rays coming out from it. So it may indicate that David was a Mason. And then at the bottom of it, the epitaph reads, in the midst of life, in the center, it reads, in the midst of life, we are in death. Going back to my little conversation about epitaphs, this is oftentimes the epitaphs can be a clue to what they are trying to convey, or to the circumstances of the person's death. So oftentimes you'll see this phrase, which is quite old itself, in relation to, you'll see it on memorials for people who died young. And you even still hear people use this phrase occasionally now and then, often to indicate sort of a reminder. They call a memento mori, a remember that you must die, remember death idea, that it can come at any time. And particularly in the 19th century, when people had so many accidents, could die of so many diseases, etc., you can understand why these kinds of things would have quite a visceral meaning to people. Also, I found this one as an aside, I found it interesting. I've seen this several times, where crab apples and various other things fall perfectly or are brought there by an animal and left there. So anyway, it's an aside, but I imagine one or two people were distracted by it, like me. So anyway, just a beautiful stone, quite a little nice piece of art. Again, unfortunately, it's old and tends to be quite dirty, but you can still see quite a lot going on here in terms of the different scripts and the, relief lettering here, and then incise lettering here, relief lettering here. And then you can imagine the skill that would have been involved to carve something like this. So this gives you an indication. You can imagine stone was put here probably around the time that David died, within several years, I would imagine. And so you can imagine somebody in the Victorian era walking through the cemetery, and, somebody that maybe didn't have access to, or didn't have easy access to seeing art like this, would definitely stop and appreciate it, because it is beautiful art even to us today. This next stone I wanted to include, just because it's an interesting example of some of the mysteries you encounter. And again, dare I say, fun in related to a subject as serious as death, but some of the interesting research and the mysteries that you come across that cause you to ask questions and start to to dig a little bit deeper, pardon the pun. I actually just noticed this the last time, so it's kind of goes against what I said about my first eyes on the cemetery, but I wanted to include it because I had never noticed it in all the other times I had walked. And what's interesting about it, I had noticed it, so it's Elizabeth is at the top, and I hope you forgive me, I didn't intend to cut her off, but the stone was put likely for her after she died in 1869. But what caught my eye this time was the fact that in very faint lettering here, so the name is Richard Hodgins, died in 1854, aged 55 years. And in very faint, you can see who died and was buried at sea. So I'm trying to do more research into Richard. Again, it's hard this year. A lot of this research is very hard with COVID-19 because your usual resources are not necessarily available and you're sort of just doing online stuff for the most part. But an intriguing mystery. It makes you wonder, and I started trying to play around with, maybe shipwrecks or things like that, but it doesn't sound like it was a shipwreck. It sounds like he died on board a ship and was buried at sea. So I'm trying to find out more, and I wish I had more to tell you, but I just wanted to include it because I thought it was a great example of how you walk around these places many times and you notice something new each time, especially in a cemetery as big as Victoria Lawn, where you can walk it all the time and see something new every time. And I've talked to the groundskeepers before, the maintenance staff, and numerous ones have told me that they've worked there for a long time and they still notice new ones all the time when they're doing their work. So it's just an interesting mystery you come across, and you come across quite a few of these in these large old cemeteries. So this is for a infant, Gertrude Martha Smith. So sadly, it's been sort of pushed off its base a little bit here, probably being hit by something, I would imagine, or moved, unfortunately, maybe vandalism, I'm not sure, but likely being hit by a mower or something. But over time, it's been pushed off here, but still a beautiful stone. And I haven't been able to find a death record for Gertrude, so I don't know what caused her death. But again, at 1 year old at that time, you can imagine any number of things. But wanted to show it to you because it's another great example of some of the symbols you see. So getting close up here. So you can see it's on some rocks here, some stones, and then it's almost like a cairn kind of deal. And then you have a scroll coming across the front here. So scrolls often symbolize life, but they also were great artistic devices for monument makers because, of course, they convey this idea of the deceased being written on, like a life being written on paper or whatever, and that has biblical, also has biblical reference as well. But this one's interesting because this is an example. You'll see hands on stones, the old stones, quite a bit, and the most common one are the two hands clasping each other, which often is for a husband and wife, and you'll see an epitaph above that just says farewell or see you in heaven, something along those lines. And in those cases, it's relatively easy to surmise what the message is: husband and wife parting, hoping to meet again in heaven. But sometimes you'll come across a hand coming down. So, and I'm going to show you another one after, but in this case, you can see there's a hand here, and there's a finger. So this is the finger here, the hand here. So these are lily of the valley here. And then this looks like some kind of lily. It's hard to tell when it's stylized like this and very small and with just the white color, but this is definitely a lily of the valley. And this is, so the hand coming down represents the hand of God. So, and this comes from other tradition of not, that it in ancient times that it was considered a faux pas to portray an image of God. This, of course, was changed later on and not seen as a big deal at all, hence the Sistine Chapel. But in this case, it sort of follows this tradition. And for monument makers, it was easier for them to convey a symbol or a message like this. So when the hand is coming downwards, it represents the hand of God. And in the case where you see the hand of God coming down and either pointing a finger, or as in the next example, I'll show you pulling on something, it's invariably, in my experience, for somebody who died young or somebody who died accidentally, unexpectedly, however you want to term it. So there are many examples I've come across like this in the Niagara region, and every time it's for somebody either who died quite young, as in this case, an infant, or I've seen it for workplace accidents. There's a young man at St. Mark's, Niagara-on-the-Lake, that died in a railway accident, and it's on his. And I've seen it many other places, actually across Ontario, and it's seen in the US as well. So in this case, the symbolism is the hand of God coming down and basically taking the life, or it's an indication that God has taken the person. And then the symbolism of lilies symbolize numerous things, but usually the idea is something about purity and resurrection because of Easter lilies and the name Easter or Jesus. And then lily of the valley also is usually interpreted as a symbol of renewal or resurrection because it's an early blooming flower in the spring. So the symbolism here is both, as in a lot of cases, both sort of sadness and mourning, but also hope in a resurrection and hope that the deceased soul is going elsewhere. So in the next example, this is another example of it, and I wanted to show you this one. So this stone is sadly so eroded to the point where you can't even read the inscription anymore. That's why I chose just to focus on the symbol at the top, on the motif at the top. But here again, you have the hand of God. So you have this roundel here sort of framing it. Then you have you can see the cuff, and then you can see the hand here, see the fingers. Now, very hard to see because of the age of the stone, the erosion of it, and it's dirty. But it's actually a chain, and this is the hand of God pulling up a broken chain. And so the one that I referenced at St. Mark's a few minutes ago for the young man who died in a railway accident, exact same motif, the hand of God coming down, pulling a broken chain. So in my experience, and I always say in my experience because old cemeteries are interesting, that 99 times out of 100, you'll be correct in your assumption. And then the one time somebody chose to use it in a different way and you realize, oh, you can't always generalize. But in my experience, as I said, invariably, this is for somebody who died young or unexpectedly or quickly from a disease, like within a week or a month, something very quick. So without even seeing the inscription, I can usually surmise, or you can usually surmise that with this used here, that this person died young, or either by an accident or a short illness of some kind. So just another example of how you can use these symbols, these motifs, as a way to get clues about the person, and also they're sort of just these mysterious things that are interesting to. The more you see them, the more you can find patterns, and you'll see these patterns across different areas. And then when you do see the occasional exception, it causes you to ask further questions. So regardless, it's always a learning experience one way or the other. This is another one, another symbol I wanted to talk about. So this is for sorry, I'm just flipping my page here. So this is for a young man, or sorry, not young man, or a slightly older man by their day standards, Felix Goodwin. So Felix was a carpenter. He died at 59 from heart disease in 1880. So first off, it has this beautiful sort of shield or crest or whatever you want to call it here for the inscription. You'll occasionally see these, and so it's sort of used as a artistic device, framing device for the inscription here. And, I mean, if you're used to, or if you have seen, heraldic crests and things like that, the sort of use of these becomes a little obvious, usually to symbolize family and things. But in this case, it seems that monument makers wanted to use them as sort of framing devices. And they're just nice to look at. But of particular interest here is this, which is an anchor. So going back to the recumbent cross at the beginning, and saying that oftentimes the first few times you visit old cemeteries, you make mistakes about what these things might mean, or even today there are still misconceptions. A lot of things, like the internet always is, it's a repository of great information sometimes and poor information others. So the anchor in most cases does not mean that the deceased was a sailor. It actually is a reference to hope. Sorry, excuse me, I just need water here. So it is, the anchor is often a symbol of hope, most of the time a symbol of hope and faith. So the hope in an afterlife. And so this is actually directly referenced in the New Testament, and it's in the Epistle to the Hebrews. And so it's Hebrews 6:18-20, and I'm just going to quote it so you can see what I mean here. But it says, that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil. So I'm doing the old school King James version of the Bible with the old school language. But I'm sure you heard the word hope twice there, and then the anchor of the soul. So here you have what the symbolism actually is. This idea that faith and hope, that again, this idea that the deceased is gone, but they have gone into the veil, so to speak, in hope and in faith that this is not the end for them. So just briefly, I'm almost at the end here. Just briefly, another example, and this one it was really challenging and to see, I should say, challenging to see. But so this is actually an anchor here. This is the bottom of the anchor here. And then the top is very eroded, but it's here. And you will occasionally see this on old stones as well. And the book, 99% of the time, means the Bible. And again, the anchor here, in this case, is like conveying the message that it's a statement of piety or a statement of faith. So the idea, the book, i.e. the Bible, is my anchor, my hope, my faith, etc. So, and you will occasionally, I've seen it with a heart as well, and a sacred heart, but oftentimes I've seen it with this book here and with the anchor sort of behind it, sort of grabbing it. So again, once you sort of know the meaning behind it, you can surmise it each time you see it. This is another one that caught my eye. I remember the first time I walked this cemetery, and here, this one, it's actually it's a family monument. There's several people, but I just chose to focus on hers because it was the first side I saw. She died. This is Janet. She died at just 25. Of also, the death record says consumption, but that was often, it meant a lot of things, but oftentimes tuberculosis. So she died of tuberculosis in 1888. So yet another example, yet again, proving the point or hammering home the point that tuberculosis killed many, many people. But the top of the stone's interesting. So again, a close up here. So here you have this sort of drapery or veil, they call it. So drapery or veil, or sometimes even a pall. I've heard it called a pall, though it looks more like drapery with the tassels here in the fringe. But covering the top here, and you see these two books. So oftentimes you'll see in some of the big older cemeteries, you'll see the two books or a book. The book almost always, again, means the Bible. And this is hammered home by many times that I've seen that it actually says scriptures on the side or literally Holy Bible. So no guesswork needed there. But in this case, you have two books. So you look at it at first and you think, what does that mean? Two books. Did the deceased like to read? Well, perhaps. But in this case, you have a larger book and a smaller book. And again, putting yourself in the context of the 19th century when faith and religion were such a huge part of people's lives, at least publicly they professed it. You think of what two books could they be talking about? Well, Old Testament here, which is larger, New Testament here, which is smaller. And so again, this veil, and then the veils often symbolize or have been interpreted as the veil between life and death. It's also been interpreted as the old tradition of putting a pall over the coffin or casket. And this is, of course, again, a lot of people don't realize this is where we get the term to cast a pall over something. So sort of cast darkness or sadness or bad things over something. So, but in this case, it likely means the veil between life and death. And then again, going back to that biblical passage I quoted just now about entering into the veil. So again, a statement likely of faith here. So entering into the veil in faith or something along those lines. So again, a great example of how you can sort of do some educated guessing based on what you see on the monument itself. And I know it sounds repetitive because so many of these things have to do with faith, but those were the times. So the last one I wanted to point out is a unique monument in this cemetery. I've only seen one that I can recall. And these were, it's actually made of zinc, and they were advertised as and manufactured it to be called white bronze, which was basically just to associate it with the sort of prestige of bronze monuments and things, and to sort of convey or to sort of ignore the fact that it wasn't stone. But in this case, so what's interesting about these monuments is that they're actually hollow. So on the inside, if you actually walk up to one, and I never advise people go and start playing around with monuments. I have a very strict don't touch policy, even if I am very curious and want to, or if I want to fix something, the only thing I will do is fix things at the bottom if a flag is fallen over, etc. But I try not to touch the monuments just because unless it's for a family member, it's not really in my place to do so. But if you actually just tap very lightly with your finger, you can hear a ringing sound that indicates it's hollow. So these were manufactured, the White Bronze Company was actually out of Connecticut, Bridgeport, I think, if I remember correctly. But they had a subsidiary factory in St. Thomas, Ontario. And so oftentimes, this one actually doesn't happen, but oftentimes around the base, you'll see it actually says White Bronze Company, St. Thomas, ONT. And all of the monuments that were of this type that were made in Canada came, at least the Canadian examples come from that factory. So, and then here you can see 1887, this is for the Thiel family. And so these panels, what would happen is they were precast at the factory. So you had an actual catalog that you would select the style you wanted from, and then you could further narrow it down to certain symbols you wanted and things like that. Here you have this sort of, I don't have a close up here, but it looks like, again, like swag, a swag of some kind. But anyway, then so you could further narrow down, say, oh, I want an angel here, or I want a sheaf of wheat or whatever, and then even choose the type. So in this case, they chose an obelisk. So it was precast at the factory. And then for the first person, usually that the monument was for, they would then have a panel made and sent out. So this is actually a zinc panel here. This other one is actually stone, which indicates that it was made later after the company went belly up I think it was around just after the First World War in Canada. But you'll see these stone examples sometimes that were done sort of by a DIYer to fit in there. For the family members that passed away afterwards, or if they couldn't afford it, or if the agent, these were actually sold by local agents. So if maybe there wasn't an agent in the area anymore and the person couldn't get it, they would sometimes put these little stone ones in to fit in there. But the panels actually have bolts on them. You can see there's one here, and then one here, and then there's a missing one here. And it's sad when you see them without these, but in some cases I've seen ones with it where the panels have either been removed or have fallen out. You can actually look right in it and see inside and see that it's hollow. It's not hugely exciting. You just see the other side of the bolts, and then sometimes garbage, unfortunately, from people throwing garbage in there, or perhaps being blown in over time. But they're very interesting and unique because from far away, the first time you see one, people often mistake them for stone, but over time they sort of have this bluish gray color. And once you start to see a few, you can walk into any old cemetery and spot them right away, even sometimes from the road, because the color stands out so much compared to the stone. You can look behind it compared to these other colors, it stands out very well. So I'll challenge you, if you're in the area, to try and find this one. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's the only one, or it is the only one I can remember seeing. Some cemeteries will have 3 or 4, but they're an interesting little unique example. They didn't survive the test of time largely because people saw them as sort of cheap imitations. So, white marble particularly was seen as the prestigious stone, the most expensive stone to have. So those were the ones that people wanting to demonstrate social standing or wealth or whatever, posturing, whatever you want to call it. Those were the ones that they often chose. So these fell out of favor and didn't tend to be hugely popular at any cemetery that we know of. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never seen more than several in one cemetery. So just a neat little throwback to a time when somebody tried to do things a little differently. And what makes these neat is that this one is actually sort of settled into the ground and sort of caving in down here, but they hold up very, very well to the elements compared to stone because of the fact that the zinc develops this sort of coating, and then it protects them from the elements. So if you actually look at these panels, like this one that's made of the zinc, You can read it clear as day, as if it was manufactured yesterday. And other than the fact that this one's a little dirty, if this was cleaned up, it would almost look brand new, aside from the fact that this stone sticks out in color. So anyway, that's it for today. So before we go on to questions, thank you very much for watching. Thank you, Adrian, particularly. I know we did a lot of back and forth with the emails and things, and so I appreciate you being patient with me on the back and forth. And thanks for asking. Thanks to the museum. And I encourage, if you're not sticking around for questions, I encourage, I will be providing here my information. So if you want to get in touch with me, if you're not sticking around for questions, I can be contacted through the email, Gmail. I also have a website. I'm very active on Twitter daily. Instagram, not quite as much. I tend to post every few days, and it's usually just a repeat of the Twitter content, but I am on there occasionally. And then I actually have started doing some YouTube videos. I don't have very many yet. I'm trying to get better and professionalize them a little more, but I'm getting started on it. So if you go there and have a look and like it, please subscribe. And that's it. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Adam. That was wonderful. I have so many comments, which I will say for our question period, but I want to say that I also spend a lot of time in the cemetery, and I don't think I've seen I've seen some of those stones, but not all of those stones. So that was, I kind of feel a little ashamed a little bit, actually, that I don't recognize all the stones. So
you have the excuse that there are 31,000 of them. So.
Yeah, I guess, I guess that's true. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do spend a lot of, like you, I do spend a lot of time in the cemetery. And yeah, so there's tons, and as well, I see new things every single time. And so many of them as well look the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes when we're trying to, like, if I identify a stone and a person as, oh, we should put them on a tour, and we go out one day and then go out the next day, and I can't find them again because the stone is so similar to so many others.
Yeah. For
so
sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for attending tonight's lecture, everybody. I think there are some questions coming in. So if you enjoyed tonight's lecture, everybody, and Adam, I'm just going to steal my screen share back, but I'll give it back to you in case anybody else has wants to see a specific slide. So I'll just give it back to you.
Sure.
Yep. But I just want to use the PowerPoint for a second. Awesome. Now where am I here? Okay. So if you enjoyed tonight's lecture and Adam's wonderful talk, please consider making a donation to the museum so we can continue to deliver the high quality programming you expect from us. Every bit helps. To make a donation, please call the museum during our operating hours at 905-984-8880. If you have any questions about tonight's presentation, as I mentioned, you can pop them in the chat box to the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll read them out to Adam. While I give you a few minutes to post your questions, I'd just like to remind everyone of our next lecture next week, September 29th. I'll present Where They Walk, the making of the annual guided spirit walks, with a behind-the-scenes look at the annual guided spirit walks, including a look into the many primary sources that make the walks possible, and such a great window into our history. So we'll Adam's talk was very tangible about the cemetery. My talk will be very intangible, talking about a lot of the history that we can't visually see in the cemetery. I'd also like to remind, there's my slide for that. I always forget to advance. I'd also like to remind everyone just to take a few minutes to please like, follow, or subscribe on our social media channels, including here on YouTube, to stay on the loop with all of our virtual programming during this difficult time and sort of suspension of in-person programming. So do like, share, follow, subscribe, all the stuff. Please also share, again, the museum with your own social networks to help more of our community join in the fun historical adventures. Also, if you love a deep dive into, if you love the deep dive nature of a lecture series, why not also try one of our podcasts? And Adam, I think I'm going to have you on for a podcast as well.
Sounds great.
So we can get a little bit more conversational about your topic. We have two podcasts, Museum Chat Live and 1 hour in the past. You can catch our podcasts on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And you can look for them at STC Museum Podcasts. They're a good time. Finally, don't forget, Saturday at 7 p.m. or 6:30 p.m. with the pre-show chat with cast and crew is the live stream of our annual, now virtual guided spirit walks at Victoria Lawn Cemetery. Send us an email at museum@stcatharines.ca to register. Okay, I know we have a bunch of wonderful comments in the chat box. So those are really great. Congratulations.
Is there a way I can see it? I don't.
You have to open the stream, unfortunately.
Okay.
I might be able to, hold on. I might be able to, if I have the stream open.
Will it be in the video that when it's posted afterwards?
No, unfortunately the chat box doesn't go to the video, but I will share, with you. Here we go. There's a copy of the stream there. So you can see the chat box on the right. So lots of really great comments. This is kind of awkward because now it's going to be a strange meta view of, it's going to be a double view for our YouTube viewers. But Des had a question at the top of the presentation, actually. His question is, there are many stones in Homer Cemetery, just across the canal, which show years, months and days, all from the 1800s. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason that, like, you would put specific years, months, days?
That's a very good one. Unfortunately, I don't have a definitive answer. This is something that's puzzled me for a long time as well, and it's very puzzling. This is something that seems to be uniquely Canadian, and it's often commented on by people from Britain, where that's not a common thing, or at least at all, I don't think. And for some reason in the Canadian context, we wanted to get very, very specific and put it right down to the days, which is also interesting to me because oftentimes I've come across stones where the death record year doesn't match the tombstone year. So the fact that they weren't even getting the years right all the time makes it seem strange that they would try to get it right down to the day. But I've looked far and wide in the literature and asked questions of many people to try and find out why or where this tradition developed from. I haven't come across a definitive answer yet. So if anybody else has leads, I would love to hear them. But this is one I've gotten before, and it's one that still puzzles me because it is something that's unique about ours, and very, you see that not just in Homer, you'll see that in a lot of old cemeteries on stones from usually the early to mid 1800s. I have seen it even on some elsewhere, even earlier. But it is something that has puzzled me. So sorry, I wish I had a better answer, but if you come up with the answer, then you'll really super impress me because I've tried really hard and I can't find it. So
it's a great question. I'm going to look into it too. That's if you can't find it, then
it's a tricky one.
Yeah. I had a question and I actually also want to encourage everyone to visit Victoria Lawn Cemetery to look for some of the stones that Adam was talking about tonight. But I wanted to just get a sense of, I know you're not, the official cemetery person, but I just wanted to get a sense of cemetery etiquette, especially for people who are interested in exploring historically or historic stones. And if you have any tips for because if people feel awkward going, and if there's other people around, that kind of thing, if you have any tips for sort of cemetery etiquette.
Sure, yeah. Well, I have everybody, there are different, people have different opinions on this. I actually have, my family has, we have relatives buried at Victoria Lawn, one in the old section, one in the new at least. And in my experience when I'm visiting them, especially Victoria Lawn, it is still an active cemetery, and you will, even last week while visiting, there was actually the start of a funeral. While we were in the new section, there was a start of one on the other side. And quickly, my general etiquette or rule is I explore the old sections of the cemetery mainly. I don't usually go to the new sections unless there's nobody around. And even then, if I see a car approaching or people approaching, I'll leave immediately that area, because you don't know why they're there. And if it's a new section, they could be there to mourn and they could be there to visit. And oftentimes they are. And I never want to look like my interest is disrespectful to their emotions or their reason for being there, because they are primarily beyond places of history. They are primarily places for people to visit and to bury deceased loved ones. So that for me, it's sort of convenient that I like the historical, very old stones, because when I go to those sections, it's very, very rare. I can literally think of only a handful of times I've ever seen somebody visiting a relative from like the 1850s at the same time that I'm there. They do visit, and I know they do, because Victoria Lawn especially, I go, and one time I see flowers that weren't there before, or some other sort of token of remembrance that's there. So it does happen, but your chances of that your chances are much lower. And it's the same reason on social media. I have a policy on social media that I don't tend to post stones that are younger than, say, 80 years or so, because it's different for somebody to look at, for me to walk to an old stone and say, oh, isn't this symbol very neat? And if that's a symbol from 150 years ago and a relative sees it, I mean, how much emotional, visceral connection do we have to relatives from 150 years ago? They're sort of like what I call that, oh, it's that great, that's cool, that's my great great uncle, like Annie or whatever. If it's from the 1850s, if Annie died in 2018, it's going to be, that's really sad, and oh my God, that's my Aunt Annie, and it makes me upset. So having that emotional distance, I think, and that historical distance, for me, I think is a better way of getting around that. And so I only tend to post stones, unless we're talking about a public figure where the circumstances in the case or whatever is very public and known. Then you don't really run into quite as many ethical issues. But I tend to only post stones. Usually for me, I like to use the privacy age as the, like right now, the youngest records you can access online on like Ancestry or Family Search or whatever from 1948, I think. So I won't post anything from beyond that unless it's exceptional circumstances. And in the rare cases where I do post a picture or I'm in an area, a newer area, if I take a picture, I will take out all of the personal information except for like the epitaph that I found inspiring or whatever. So that way there's no way for people to necessarily identify. And I'll sometimes even angle my camera so that nothing can be seen except for the little part that I want to look at. And again, sorry, I'm kind of long-winded here, but generally my rule is just if I'm in an area and somebody looks like they're there for a purpose other than like me just to explore, I'll usually just leave, and because that's really the respectful thing to do. So.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. That is it for questions, but there were some really great comments. What I'll do is, so you have them, I'll screenshot them for you.
Okay, thanks.
But
and thank you for your kind comments, everybody.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, easily deserved, because it was a wonderful presentation. And thank you very much for kicking off our autumn fall lecture series
here at the
museum. And thank you again, everyone, for tuning in tonight. We'll see you in 2 weeks for my lecture on the behind the scenes at Guided Spirit Walks, where I'll talk, actually Adam was talking a little bit about the challenges of doing some of this history work in the cemetery. And I'll get into some of those challenges too. But until then, thank you everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks everybody.